Today it's my great pleasure to talk with Professor Rich Petty. He's at Ohio State University, where he's in the Department of Psychology, which he chairs. He's the head of the Attitudes and Persuasion Laboratory. He's studied attitudes and persuasion, that is, how people develop attitudes about specific things, develop their beliefs, and how attitudes can be changed through persuasion. He's the author of the book Attitudes and Persuasion. And today I want to focus with him on anti-science attitudes and sort of counteractive measures that maybe scientists can take. And so, Rich, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
And so you started working on this in the 1970s, is that right?
Yeah, way back in grad school, began to do this work.
And that was at Ohio State?
It was, yeah. My grad training was at Ohio State, and then my first academic job was at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, and I was there for about a decade. And then somehow they convinced me to come back here to Ohio State.
Yeah, they liked you.
I guess, or forgot what I was like.
And so can you talk a little bit about how one as a research psychologist studies attitudes and persuasion? And I mean, what you could look, I guess, at kind of surveys in populations, or you could actually set up some experiments to test this or in the laboratory. I guess particularly with persuasion, you can do that.
Yeah, so within the field of sort of attitudes, more generally, or opinions, there are kind of two categories of researcher, grossly, although different people do both kinds of things. There is the survey research contingent, that ends up being mostly political scientists and maybe people in communications, where they want to know, well, what are people's opinions at any given point in time about the environment or whatever it happens to be. And very interesting work is they'll track people's opinions over time to try to see how things are changing, maybe with respect to racial prejudice or whatnot. And there's some social psychologists who do very interesting work in that domain. Then there are others who are more like myself, who you might call experimentalists. So what we do in our research is we manipulate things, randomly assign people to conditions where they might get, message A or message B, or source A or source B, or they get a message when they're manipulated to be in a good mood or not a good mood, or they're feeling happy or sad or whatever. There are, as you might imagine, a ton of different things you could manipulate. And then because people are randomly assigned to different conditions, trying to hold everything else constant, like in any good experiment, besides the thing that you're concerned about. And then you look at maybe their attitudes at time 1 versus time 2 in the different conditions and see whether you get more change under conditions A or B. Or a lot of studies use a post-only design, and so you don't measure their attitudes at the beginning, because sometimes when you do that, people get frozen to that attitude and they'll just report the same attitude at time 2 just because that's what they remember they said at time 1. So often you just compare groups after they get the treatment. There's no pre-measure, and if they differ after the treatment, of course, and they were randomly assigned, you can attribute any differences after they get the communication to whatever it was that you manipulated. So that's what I've been doing. That's the approach I've taken over the past 30 plus years.
And do you mainly work with students then as subjects, or do you expand beyond that? Obviously, because students at the university aren't necessarily representative of the whole population, right?
Yeah, so that's a really important point. Students would be a really terrible population to study if you wanted to know, what the attitudes of Americans are about something, because they're totally non-representative. But if you want to know, for example, how they respond
Oh,
When they're in a good mood or a bad mood, the most important thing is they are humans. And so humans tend to respond very similarly when they're in a good mood as opposed to a bad mood. And so if you want to know just what the direction of an effect is, like, is it good to be in a good mood, or maybe a good mood is distracting and it's bad? Uh, Undergraduates serve as a very useful population, like they might in a study in biology, where you just want to know, does the vaccine work? Well, they're humans and they're 99% uh, like adults. There are some differences, of course. There are lots of individual differences, gender differences, and age differences, and so many kinds of things that could magnify an effect or reduce an effect. But we're more interested in the direction of the effect. Is something going to be a positive impact or not a positive impact? And so undergrads are perfectly good for that. And anytime you test it with a larger population, it's very rare for the direction of the effect to be different, although the effect might be bigger if you got a sample. So much of the time, excuse me, we start with an undergraduate population to test our materials and things like that to sort of see what the nature of the effect is. But more and more these days, where it's very easy to recruit online samples, you then go on and do a similar kind of experiment. And so because everybody has computers these days, you can show them video stimuli. You can. It used to be very difficult to recruit, and now many of the online platforms will say, we'll even give you a nationally representative sample if you want to do that. Or do you want to look at older women who are in nursing homes? We can get that sample for you. You just need the money to be able to
yeah,
do
that's what I was thinking. I was at the National Institute on Aging for 20 years, more as a lab chief. And yeah, so there could be a lot of age-related factors involved in some of the work you're doing, certainly. And
Yeah.
There's these kind of old, almost it's not really science, but just the general thinking that as people get older, they're less flexible in changing their beliefs or attitudes, which I think that's probably true.
Yeah, it's often a function, it's difficult to say it's age, even though there is that correlation over time. It's like, well, what is age really standing for? And so often it's knowledge, right? So the more knowledge you get about something, the more difficult it is to change your opinion, or the more experience you get on something. So even within the undergraduate population, the students vary in how much knowledge they have about something. So, once the key is in virtually any demographic thing. And so, it might be, oh, gee, men are easier to persuade on this topic than women. And you go, well, is that really a gender difference? Or is this a topic men know less about? Or is this something that men have more confidence in? And so what's the psychological variable that's behind this demographic shift, whether it's gender or race or age or something like that? So we try to turn all this. So that's a good example of where survey research might say, oh, look, there's a gender difference on this topic. And we're more interested in, like, well, why is that? Is it really gender? And most of the time, it turns out it's not really gender or age or race. It's some other psychological variable that's correlated with demographics.
Yeah, and of course, when I think of knowledge base and anti-science attitudes, or at least, what's a person's confidence or trust in science in general? Well, as you know, there's been a decline in the scientific literacy of the population as a whole, and in scientific training. Just simple things like, what's the difference between probability and possibility, and statistics and things like global warming, and there's always some always some uncertainty in science, but by doing a lot of analysis and so on, you can sort of put relative numbers on the likelihood of this being effective or this happening in the future in the case of climate change. So the reason I invited you for this is really, I saw your article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science last year on why people are anti-science and what can we do about it. And then you lay out like 4 different reasons, I guess you'd say, or 4 different core factors driving anti-science attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little about those? So the first was source credibility.
Right. Well, one of the things we tried to do then in this paper that you mentioned with Aviva Philip Muller is the lead author, and Spike Lee, a collaborator on this.
Not the well-known Spike Lee.
Not the director, the poor guy who always gets, and then he's working with Richard Petty, the famous race driver. So we have these,
Yes, that's true.
we have these famous names, but not who you think they are. Although I'm sure, Spike gets more misdirected emails than I do, but I get plenty, supposedly for the race car driver. But yeah, so there's been an explosion, as you know, of literature on anti-science attitudes, and whether it's COVID certainly showed that really amazingly well about people who had misinformation about vaccines or what to do when you get COVID, and spread by all sorts of different kinds of sources. And so this literature had begun to grow, and Aviva, who's the lead author, is particularly interested in science attitudes in particular. So in discussions we've had, and a lot of this literature is very specific, right? So it would be like, why do people continue to believe the Earth is flat? So that's just misinformation, or that the sun revolves around the Earth. Like, aren't these settled, or that vaccines don't work? Isn't there enough evidence that why would someone think vaccines don't work? And so there are lots of different papers studying those particular beliefs, like why do people deny climate change? And so as we began to talk about this more and more, even though there are different reasons why people might deny climate change or deny that vaccines work, very different, very particular things that relate there. There are a number of common themes across all those different areas. And so that's what we tried to talk about in this paper, so some of the commonalities. And it turns out that when you look at the literature on science denial, or why people have these beliefs, and you try to pull out the core factors, and maybe not shockingly, it's like they're the same core factors that determine whether people have any beliefs, right? Even correct ones. So yeah, you can believe misinformation, but at the time you get it, you don't know it's misinformation.
Yeah.
It's just information. And you have to decide. I can give you something true about a vaccine. And you can ask, well, what leads you to accept that true information that I just told you about a vaccine? Or what leads you to accept this new idea from science? Because you don't know if it's true or false. And so that I think is sort of the core thing of the paper. It's like, let's go through some of these, what people like me who's been studying attitudes and persuasion for decades would say, wow, when you take that lens to it, we can really apply everything we know about what causes you to believe that your teeth will get white if you use this particular toothpaste. Is that true or not? It's just information. It's that they're trying to sell you this toothpaste by convincing you that you will have whiter teeth. And here are the reasons why it's good to have white teeth, and people will like you, and whatever they're trying to sell. But it's the same issue. And so
I could have had my teeth whitened as I got older. They got yellow, but I didn't want to pay the money to do it.
But someone would like to convince you to do that, right? Or,
Yeah.
or to buy anything.
Oh, they did at the dentist's office.
They do. They sell right there, right? So the dentist is a credible source, right? Which is the first factor. It's basically the sort of classic that they've been studying when persuasion came into existence, really as a scientific discipline. By scientific, I mean doing randomly controlled experiments during World War II, where the U.S. government funded studies during World War II. You imagine Nazi propaganda. Why does it work? How do people fall for this stuff? and so forth. How do we protect people from, believing things that are racist or counterproductive or against our capitalist system or whatever, communism? The government's always been interested in, they call it propaganda as opposed to persuasion, but that's just, propaganda is trying to influence somebody on a topic you don't like, right? Whereas we can just say generically persuasion, and that's sort of what the information misinformation space is. What my information might be your misinformation. That's sort of people how you see it. Of course, there is objective truth, right? Or at least so as scientists, we like to think that they're, at least, even if we don't want to go so far as to say it's absolutely true, we'll say, well, it's the scientific consensus that based on all the evidence that we have available, we're going to, say that this is what we believe to be the case. And scientists agree because we've done, the evidence is consistent with this view, but not that view, because we do these studies to say, if you're going to say a vaccine works, the first thing a scientist says, well, what's the evidence? Did you do a randomly controlled study where you had the vaccines and the non-vaccines, and are the same people? And did you control for all the confounds? And then if the data show this, you can say, seems like it works. Yeah. And you go, oh, well, how much does it work? Because then that becomes a practical issue. If it works significantly, 1% better than not, but it costs $10 million a dose, well, it's like, okay, it works, but practically it's not sufficiently cost effective. But that's a separate issue. That is the political issure, right? The scientific issue is, does it work and how big is the effect? And that's what you do in persuasion. It's
in the case of Vex, and of course your background. So I grew up, my mother was a nurse on the polio ward at St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester, Minnesota, which is where it's the main hospital for the Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
And, she would come, I remember, I was little then, very little. Mm-hmm. She would come home and talk about these kids with polio, and then the vaccine essentially wiped it out. And it was the same with smallpox, so it's interesting. You kind of tend to think that older people that, were still living at the time when they were, or heard stories from their parents or grandparents, would be pretty persuaded that in general vaccines are good.
Yeah, if it's not in your current experience, people, it's harder to believe things. There's nothing better than to convince you than to have you experience it yourself, right? Yeah. As opposed to book learning or things like that. But one of the main things, that's very different now, and one would have to worry if we had polio or some other kind of thing that was, far more deadly than, COVID was bad enough, but imagine something like Ebola, where something is really horrible and kills lots more people. Back then in the polio days, there was the newspaper that people got.
Yeah.
The radio, maybe they'd hear things, and pretty much everything they heard was that, oh, this polio vaccine really works. You want your kids to get it.
Yeah.
And that was it. And so there was no channel you could go to that was an anti-polio vax channel or newspaper, right? And so that's one of the huge differences that really is very much in the modern era. Even when I grew up, we didn't have one newspaper, but there may be multiple, but we had the 3 or 4 TV stations, and they all pretty much were mainstream and kind of said the same thing. So it's the classic, we would agree on the facts and we might disagree about the solution. But today, the biggest problem that we talk a little bit about in this paper is that people have polarized into these different information environments. Yeah. Where no matter how wacky your belief is, that we would say it's a wacky belief, you can find a community of supporters who have that belief and will reinforce that belief and say, I believe it too. And then and all these other people are against us because they don't know the truth. And there's nothing more powerful than to feel like it's me against them, whoever they are. And that's
in these information bubbles, there's often some charismatic person, kind of forwarding information that goes against the science or any, well-developed evidence, and people can get attracted to that.
Yeah, good leaders or bad leaders, however, whatever.
Yeah.
But people, charismatic people, going all the way back to the one we know the best, Adolf Hitler, who was very, would give those speeches that would have people mesmerized.
Yeah.
His simple message and simple language and the message that we're better than others. There's nothing more powerful than a message that we're better than others. And sometimes the message is that explicit that we're better than those people.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just we have the special knowledge that others don't have, and that makes you feel special, even if you can't say I'm smarter than it. And it does sort of make you feel like, well, I know the Earth is flat, and we're special, and we can all agree with each other and reward each other, and we're different from them. So the whole us-them mentality is so fundamental to humans, and the social media environment and the cable news environment just allows that to really fester, unlike when we all had the same stuff. The mass media, it's called mass media, right? Because it went to the masses and everybody got the same thing. And there's very little mass media in the sense that there's a common message to everybody.
People seem to be attracted to controversy.
They do. And then there's, these media empires are rewarded by clicks, and we know there's nothing more clickable than something controversial or something that makes you angry.
Yeah.
Right. In psychology, there was a famous paper that just summarized it simply as bad is stronger than good. Right. And so it's like one negative thing about somebody outweighs 5 or 6 positives. And also negativity is a motivator for action. Right. So when you're angry, you got to do something. And anger is associated with confidence, that you only get angry when you're sure you're right and somebody else is wrong. Yeah. And when you're right, and that means you're justified. And that's road rage, where people get angry. And we've done some research on how anger, just even manipulated in the lab, it make people angry. They then become confident in whatever they're thinking. They're just sure whatever I'm thinking is right, even if you've manipulated what they're thinking, right? Whether they're thinking good thoughts or bad thoughts. And so for good, if you're thinking positive things, you become very confident in positive thoughts. And I'm sure I've got to help that person because so anger can lead to good if it validates and makes you feel confident about some pro-social thoughts that you have, or being cooperative, as we've studied in the lab. But when you're on the road and you think that person cut me off and they got to be stopped, and you get out of your car and we know what happens. People will do some pretty crazy things because they're sure they're right. And so that's what anger does. And it makes you go even deeper into your communities because you need to be reinforced that you're right. Because when you're sure you're right, the most threatening thing is to hear that you might be wrong. Right. And because now I've already committed to this, and I've posted about this. And so it'd be horrible to admit I'm wrong. So you'll do anything to protect your rightness. And the easiest thing you can do is tune out the other side.
Yeah.
Because that feels terrible. And then to associate with people who have the same views as I do. And that feels good. It feels good to be right. Right. To be wrong. No. Fear, on the other hand, is another negative emotion. But fear doesn't lead to confidence. So when people are afraid, it's like, "Ooh, what do I do? I'm not sure." Fear is more associated with doubt and anxiety and paralysis. Yeah. But anger, which is the thing that the social media companies have discovered, is what causes people to click more and to share more. If I'm right, I better let everybody know about this. And so that just anger feeds the whole enterprise.
When Twitter and Facebook came out, I never I never got on them at all. I don't know about you. And I could see early on that for me, this was going to be a time drain. It's
Yep.
essentially a waste of time, because I focused on research and so on, and family outside of the science. And um, yeah, so I think people wasting a lot of time and unproductively and maybe even counterproductively.
Yeah, it's a big time waste, and you're getting a lot of self-reinforcement, so it makes people less open to
Yeah,
information. And science is all about getting new information, new discoveries, and that's one thing that's confusing to people, because the science say on we've got a new disease, COVID, and do masks work or they don't, and so you got to figure that out, and so the science can change over time as studies are done, and people don't quite understand that, right? That they say science either needs to be true or it's not true. They don't know that, okay, well, right now we think this is true, but now there's some more data, and
yeah, and
now we know this.
that happened during the COVID to a big extent,
Huge.
and there was some, in the communicating to the public, there was certainly some aspects that could have been done better. The initial whether or not to wear a mask thing.
Right.
As you know, if you go to Asia, whenever there's even flu,
Yeah.
whenever there's some virus going around, people wear masks.
Yep.
Uh, and people who are sick will put a mask on because I guess,
Looking out for others.
yeah, over there more than here, they care about others,
Yeah.
And so, and then the vaccine issues, there's with using mRNA, essentially they're injecting the messenger RNA that's encoding the spike protein into your arm. The messenger RNA gets into the cells in your arm, and they produce the spike protein, which then the immune system reacts against. And somehow there's this bubbles that indicate the messenger RNA vaccine is somehow, because it was done in that way, not safe. But the data show it's pretty safe. Then there was this thing about, well, with COVID, if you get COVID, there's a chance you might get inflammation around the heart, right?
Yep.
And there is increased incidence of that in people who get the vaccine, but it's usually mild and goes away. But the risk of you dying, getting severe illness and dying from COVID is orders of magnitude more likely than something. So again, you have this probability thing. But this issue of concern for others, I thought that has been a really big factor. People don't want to change their lifestyles. They want to go out to a restaurant or a bar, and particularly a lot of young people, males mainly, particularly, think they're kind of invincible.
Right.
But they don't realize they may spread the virus to their grandmother, and I'm sure that happened,
Yeah, it's just not a norm in Western societies, right? We're much more independent. We think about ourselves more than in Eastern cultures, where they're more interdependent, and there's a much more norm about thinking of others. There are just some really interesting classic studies in the attitudes literature that you probably heard of cognitive dissonance, right? Where you get, and so anytime we make a decision, there is a little dissonance, because if you're even choosing between two mundane objects, that in an ideal world we could have both, we could have everything, we wouldn't even have to make choices, but in real life we have to make choices. And so after you've made a choice, dissonance makes the thing you chose seem even better, to sort of justify the choice, and the thing you rejected now seems even worse. So even in our own minds, there's this polarization effect. Even, we pull, so this tendency to polarize into what's good and what's bad it goes back to Leon Festinger in the 1950s, who sort of studied this in terms of choice, and all done with American college students and housewives in the studies. So they go over to Asia and do this same research for the first time, and they're not producing these dissonance effects when people make choices. That what they chose doesn't get better, and what they rejected doesn't get worse. And it's like, well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out if you change the paradigm just a little bit, but in a fundamentally important way, and instead of making a choice for myself, you're now going to make the choice for a friend. Like, you got to pick something, whether it's the meal or you want the blender or the toaster, you choose the choice for the friend. After the choice, the thing you chose for the friend now is seen much, much better. And the thing you rejected for the friend seems worse. And so the explanation, as you might imagine, is in Eastern cultures, you care more about others even than the choice. So the consequence of making a bad decision for someone else, oh my goodness, that would be horribly embarrassing if I picked the wrong thing for my mom or for my spouse or my child. That would be devastating. And so all the dissonance is, did I make the wrong choice? But when you made it for someone else, and there are consequences for them. So it fits in perfectly with what happened in COVID is, I'm going to wear the mask because if I got someone else infected, that would be would really affect me. In the US, it's like, and so the arguments, protect yourself. In Asia, protect others. So it's just a fundamental cultural differences. So dissonance exists. Everyone has this need to make the right choice, but what determines whether you feel that conflict is very different here than in Eastern cultures, though they're becoming more westernized in all sorts of ways too.
Okay, and then so the group identity is really important, right?
Yes.
And I can't remember. I think I remember when I was growing up, and there were elections. I don't know if they had this blue state, red state thing back then, or when that came in about. But if you think from an evolutionary perspective, humans are territorial in nature, right? And we probably started as hunter-gatherers, small groups, and they had some territory where they hunted and foraged, but there were other tribes, and there'd be antagonism between them. So, people tend to be territorial. I've seen this here in Maryland. It's mostly a Democratic state, but there are pockets, literally counties, that always vote Republican, a couple counties. The rest, and it, it's because people are interacting together all the time,
right?
And their attitudes coalesce.
Yep. People tend to segregate into communities of like-minded others, and that's been happening more and more. That and antagonisms among neighbors who put up the wrong political sign. It's like, how can that person? So we've just become very us them. And the amazing thing you were mentioning, sort of the evolutionary nature of it, that back in cave days there was competition for resources. Who's going to be able to feed the family? And then you got into groups to at least share among our group, but keep the good stuff away from those other people who live over the river, because we don't want them taking all the food or whatever it is. So that you can imagine the evolutionary history of it, but it's become so fundamental that back in the 60s, European social psychologists did work on what they call the minimal group effect. And so it certainly makes sense that my family and people who are really connected to me and the evolutionary thing. But what they did in this research in Europe is they literally randomly assigned people to groups. And everyone knows I randomly assigned to the red group, and we're going to wear the red shirts and they're the blue shirts. Or they would say, you took a little test and you like the paintings of this painter, and those people like the paintings of that other painter. And no one had ever heard of these painters before, and you're randomly assigned. But then they have to make choices like, okay, so here's some money, and we need to divide it among the groups, the reds and the greens. And right from the get-go, it's like, well, I want my group to get the most money. And I don't like those people. And you start to imagine all sorts of things about them, even though you know they're college students just like me. They were randomly assigned. I could have just as easily been a blue as a red. And the notion to band together into, okay, now we're this, we're this team. And in sports, it makes sense. We want to bond as a team because we really are competitive with the other team because there's a trophy at the end or there's something. But there's no anyway, it's just so fundamental that any minimal group is sufficient to invoke, some would say, this evolutionary feeling of us as opposed to them. And then it's not too far where like, well, we're better than them, right? And then once you feel like you're better than them, which is the root of most prejudice, the feeling then allows you to treat the others not as well as you treat your group, or to demonize them. And then the anger starts, like, oh, why we can't let them get in charge, or my beliefs are better. And in the belief space, once you believe your beliefs are better than other people's beliefs, or more right, then it gets very hard to change them. And back in the old days when we grew up, it was easier to change people's minds for two reasons. One we already talked about, and that was that you could give people the so-called right information that they couldn't hide into and be reinforced to think their side is right, because there was nowhere to go besides the three networks to find out what the truth was. And so that's one thing. But the second thing, and this is a topic probably I've studied more than any in my career, has to do with whether people come to their beliefs by kind of making a snap decision, sort of a more intuitive, quick, heuristic-based decision, or whether they're more thoughtful and deliberative. And so, if you're deciding based on, do I like the source, and I don't care what you say, that's a very easy thing to do. It doesn't require much thought. But to actually process the arguments that the other side's giving does require you to be a bit more deliberative and evaluate them. And so early on in my career, we studied all sorts of factors that would lead people to make their decisions more deliberatively, or more intuitively, or heuristically, or based on simple cues. And when we were doing research, I'll just give you one example. 20 years ago, for Ohio State students, let's say, and one of the ways we vary whether or not you would think carefully about something or not. So let's say we're giving something that people disagree. You're trying to convince undergraduates you should raise the tuition at their university. They don't want to raise tuition. That's universally don't want to spend the money. And so the question is, could you move them? And so you would give them a message about raising tuition at their university with certain arguments, or at a different university with the same arguments, right? And when it was their university, back when we did the first research on this, they would think about the arguments quite carefully, because it affects them. And if you had good arguments for why you should raise the tuition, like you're going to get smaller class sizes, you're going to blah, 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 they'll improve X, Y, and Z, you could move them. And if you gave stupid reasons, they would not move, right? And because they would process them. When the issue was raising the tuition at some other university, so we're at Ohio State. So say you want to raise it at University of Michigan. They didn't care whether the arguments were good or bad. It's like, whatever, I don't care. They would, if you gave more arguments, 10 as opposed to 2, they go, oh, they're 10, they must be good. Or if an attractive person said it, they go, but whatever, probably good because an attractive person said it. Those things didn't matter when they were considering it for their own university, because they were being deliberative.
Yeah.
When we do that same research now, you don't get the same deliberative response, even when it's something that's personally consequential.
Huh.
Because people, the reason for this is less clear. That some would say, well, students, they have a harder time concentrating on a 2-page long message with all these arguments, that they need the quick, what's the right answer? What's the right answer? And if a credible source says it, or somebody from the student group says it, as opposed to some other group, they're looking for, what does my side believe? And so there's this, well-known research now where you can take some new proposal, there's a proposal to do X, Y, and Z. And if you say it's a Democratic proposal or a Republican proposal, that's all that seems to matter to people.
Yeah.
They can't look at, is this a good proposal? It's like, is my side on this? And so that's the biggest change I've seen, studying attitudes and persuasion for 20 or 30 years. People are less inclined to be deliberative, and they're more inclined to want to know right away, what's the answer that is going to make me feel good, that my side wants to do. And if it's an unfamiliar one and they don't know which side's supporting it, they can think about it. But once they know, oh, this is, those people want this, or my people want this, it's very difficult to persuade them. So that's one of the things we're studying now, is how to change people's attitudes when they're deeply held.
Yeah.
Right? When they're so sure they're right.
As far as politics goes, so my father always told me you should vote for the person who is most highly qualified and you think is going to do the best job. All right. And I kind of think of elections as almost like I'm deciding who to hire for a job.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
if someone applies for the job and they don't have any knowledge, say politician knowledge of how government works, or clear positions on policies and clear evidence they understand policies and so on, and are good communicators and so on. Yeah, so I still vote for who I think is the best person, which I think is what you're saying, probably unusual. And now instead of just voting for person because they're with this party or that party.
Yeah, the irony is that more and more Americans identify as being independent, right? So you'd think, ooh, that suggests that they're gonna vote for whoever the right person is, regardless. Yeah. But independents lean one way or the other. When you ask them, like, oh, but do you lean more this way or that way? And that predicts exactly how they're going to vote. So you think that people like to think of themselves as independent-minded,
Yeah.
but in reality, it hasn't changed how.
That's interesting, because there's more independence, but there's fewer people voting in primary elections where it's just within
Right.
the party. So fewer and fewer people are probably deciding who is going to be the candidate for their party.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So partisans, one of the things we've done some research on is, do you vote for somebody, or do you vote against the other side?
Yeah.
Right. Which is, and they're different people do different things. And it turns out independents are the ones who are mostly voting against somebody.
Yeah.
Right. So they look at the candidates and they go, which one don't I want? Right. Whereas partisans will vote for someone. I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote for that person. Independents, I'm neither. So it's more, who am I going to vote against? And that leads to even more negative. So one of the trends that's kind of people are puzzled about is, why is there more negativity in politics? At the same time, we have more independence. Well, it turns out those things are very linked. That they go together, because independents are the ones looking for who to vote against. But I love what you said about trying to vote for people like you're interviewing them for a job, right?
Yeah.
So if you told people, when you find someone to paint your house or to fix your plumbing, what do you want to know? And it would be exactly what, well, I want to know how good they are, how
Yeah.
much experience they have, or whatever. I said, would you want to know if they're a Democrat or a Republican?
No.
No. But if I said, oh, there's a new tax policy, do you want to know how good who it's going to, like, I want to know who proposed it. And then that's, all you need to know. So it's very weird, isn't it? That,
Yeah.
and yet those jobs are so more consequential.
And getting back to the anti-science attitude, so so why is, so the internet's a big factor as to why there's a strong trend now to more anti-science attitudes. Do you think there's any role for better education? I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm biased on this, but I think from K through 12, there should be some brain science or even psychology incorporated into school when kids are young, so that they can get some understanding of, they have a brain, we have some understanding how it works. We know there's these different aspects of social interactions and so on, and yeah, so what's the role of education in improving confidence in science?
One of the hopes and one of the first ideas people had would be maybe that if you could train people in just scientific literacy in general, here's how scientists work and it's evidence-based, and you just sort of learn some things that are common to all science, you might come to trust science more. But it turns out the research shows that doesn't have much of an impact on their willingness to accept science in general. Training people in particular knowledge about particular things, like whether it's genetically modified foods or the data on the climate, does work better. But that's more difficult because you have to train people on every scientific issue, and the science can change, and so on and so forth. So that was a hope. But another thing that helps a bit is what used to be called inoculation, based on the idea that if you let people know a little bit about what the other side might say, like, or sometimes called forewarning, that when a vaccine is introduced, instead of just saying all the great things about the vaccine, you warn people. Some people are going to be skeptical about this vaccine because it's based on a new technology. So you kind of, some people are going to be skeptical, and you plant this little seed that this might be out there, but here's why, and so you sort of counter argue in advance what you anticipate some of the objections are. And so that was studied back in the 1960s. Initially, in the misinformation age, it's called pre-bunking something, as opposed to debunking it after you hear it, because once something gets ingrained, it's harder to correct it than to not let it get implanted to begin with. So there's been some success in this inoculation strategy. Like you get a little dose of the germ, and then your body develops antibodies. And the idea is that once there are going to be some critics of this out there, especially for something new. But because most of the time we just say the good stuff about the vaccines, or if you're for genetically modified, you just go, oh, they're great, whatever. You don't say, oh, some people are skeptical about this, and here's why. And you don't derogate it or whatever. You just say some people think this. Done some research on mask wearing, right? So here's why masks are great. It protects you, it protects everybody else, blah, 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 blah. Just they're great. Wear one. Okay, so that's what you do. As opposed to a message of, masks can be uncomfortable. And there's a sense you might have that the government's just telling you what to do. So you kind of acknowledge that here are some of the arguments you might hear, be free to go, but in the end, we want to protect everyone's life. We want to keep people, and so that just this, and that would be an inoculation thing, that if masking was introduced, anticipating what. So then when people hear it later, it's you're impinging on your. Oh, yeah, I considered that.
Yeah.
But you already have the answer. Yeah, but that's a small thing. That's a small price compared to saving people's lives. And it's just amazing when Bill McGuire first did this, he was studying it in the context of cultural truisms, like you should brush your teeth after every meal, which everybody believes. And it turned out, or democracy is good, whatever. He was studying it in the context of those kinds of what he called cultural truisms, and found that it was amazingly easy to change people's views about that because they'd never heard brushing your teeth attacked before. Right?
Yeah.
So the first person who goes, oh no, brushing your teeth is going to hurt your gums and whatever, you go, oh my God, I can't, I don't want to brush my teeth anymore. Or toothpaste is like fluoride, I guess it was back then, fluoride was like, is the enemy of the people because they're trying to,
well, there were some conspiracy theories around fluoride.
Yep.
That, the government is putting this in your drinking water, for such and such a reason. And
yep, just like they're putting stuff in the vaccine to try to get into your brain with COVID. So people would fall for that stuff. And he was studying college students at Yale. They would fall for this anti-toothbrushing message because they'd never heard anything except from their mom, brush your teeth all the time, it's good for you. But a little inoculation, like some people are skeptical about toothbrushing for this and that, but either that's misinformation or whatever. And so just and it's especially important when you first are learning something new. So the COVID context is a really important one. When if it's been around for ages, it's hard to, the flat earthers, there's probably nothing you can do to change their view, and they're a small group and not very consequential. If people believe the earth's flat, it's not going to affect the rest of us. But if you don't believe in vaccination, that could affect a lot of people, whether it's measles or a new outbreak of polio or whatever it might be, the bubonic plague. And so this inoculation is a good strategy to try to combat acceptance of misinformation in science.
We need better science communicators. You and I grew up with Carl Sagan, right?
Yep.
And he was really good at, talking to the general public in a way that didn't that made them interested and that didn't sort of put them down.
What do you think of Neil deGrasse Tyson as the new Carl Sagan?
He's pretty good, but not as good as Carl.
Yeah.
And I still remember, one of Carl's quotes. No, he testified before Congress, right? Mm-hmm. This was on climate change, right? But back in I guess it was 1980s by then. Mm-hmm. And so he said that something like this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our face.
Right.
And that there's hardly any members of Congress that have a science background.
Right.
We're seeing now with the artificial intelligence thing, they're way behind.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so it has. And then there's other forces pushing, profit-driven industries, right?
Right.
We talked briefly about this kind of the more news organizations and maybe even independent people who have some, I don't know, website or thing in a particular bubble. But there's also kind of skepticism in the pharmaceutical industry, which some of that's justified to some degree, because they are profit driven and they often hype things a little more.
Well, that's one of the biggest things that reduce the credibility of scientists is the feeling that they're for profit. And so they've used it certainly against people pushing vaccine. It's like, Fauci, do you have, is the pharmaceutical industry, paying you or whatever? And then even, climate science, people feel that somehow climate scientists profit off selling light bulbs or whatever. But it's more that the argument that's been made is like, well, their grants depend on it, their livelihood, and so they're pushing this and so forth. But the general idea to destroy someone's credibility, there's nothing more powerful than saying they have a vested interest in the position that they're taking, right? Because that totally, and the contrary, when you say something against your vested interest or against what you were expected to say, that's the most credible. So when an anchor on Fox News says the election was not stolen, wow, that's so unexpected that the credibility is so much higher, because mostly what we hear is people saying exactly what we expect them to say, and so it's very important that we have voices that don't say what they're expected to say sometimes.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. Let's see. Yeah, so we talked about, political identities, which is a big factor on kind of polarization. And historically, religions have been kind of anti-science, right? And so the telescope was invented, and you could look out and you could figure out that we're actually going around the sun isn't going around us. And then the microscope was developed, and we could see there's actually bacteria causing this disease.
Right. The germ theory, right?
The germ theory, right? And then there's pushback from religion because of, well, they have these texts that say this is the way it happened, this is the way it is, and then science is showing no, that's not the way it is. And there's still some of that religious, particularly not in general, but particularly the more extreme religious beliefs.
Yeah, it seems, anything that's clearly verifiable, like you can see what's revolving around what with your own eyes, you can see the germs. More of the science or this skepticism comes in is when it's not that easy to prove, like climate change. You can show the graph about how the temperature is doing this and that, or the number, but that's not quite as as would that have happened anyway. You can't do a controlled experiment, right? But with it's all and so even though it's the science,
but you can do experiment that show if you have a chamber and you're putting heat lamp through it and you have CO2 in there, if you increase the CO2 concentration, it gets hotter inside. So you can do an experiment to show that increased CO2 does
have these consequences, right?
These consequences, yeah.
But people will say, well, why is this? Would it have warmed? What are the other factors? I mean, in the end, it's a correlational case, which is very compelling, which is like what the cigarette industry did way back when, because no one ever did a controlled study where you randomly assign some people to smoke and others not to smoke. You had animal studies, which were, causal, but it's like, but those are animals, but humans, it could be different. And so it's like, but nothing like,
there's I was at University of Kentucky for 11 years, and they had their building, the title of the building was the Institute of Tobacco and Health. They've changed the name since I've been there, but
funded by
and then you get these. Another thing is anecdotes, right? That the smoking's a good example. Person will say, "Oh, my grandma lived to 95 and she smoked a pack a day, so it must not be bad." And so people's like anecdotal things. This is even in the news now.
Right.
For example, I don't pay much attention to, say, Fox News or MSNBC or even CNN, but I do each day look through the headlines, just see what they are. And Fox News, it's a lot of anecdotal stuff,
right?
Or just an example, and there's no analysis of the big picture, no scientific analysis. So people tend to believe those kind of personal anecdote things.
Yep.
have a stronger effect on them than actually data where you've got big populations, a lot of statistics, and you can put a probability on something.
Right, right. That goes back to the very first thing you started with, right? People don't really understand how to deal with probabilities, right? If something is 5 times more likely if you do this, it's like, well, how do I? But my grandma, lived to whatever. It's what's going to stick with you. What's memorable? What's memorable is your personal example.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's maybe one way to relate it to people is to give them an example like the following. Oh, there's this cliff on the edge of the ocean, and there's kids that dive there. These kids dive there, and it's high up. And every year, one kid, at least one kid dies. They hit their head on the bottom and die.
Right.
And then, but there was, say, a couple thousand kids died each year there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say, well, the probability of you dying if you get COVID, or your kid dying if you get COVID, is 5%, right? Mm-hmm. So, but a person will say, well, I don't want my kid to dive off the cliff, but right. I'm not going to have them get vaccinated. Right.
Right.
In other words, I guess if personally one place somebody's dying when they do this, that has a bigger effect.
Yes, and in the example you gave, there's nobody telling you it's great for kids to dive off of cliffs. Don't believe that people. Okay. So there's and so there isn't this opposition force pulling you in the direction, and that's what that's the layered on top of just pure rationality. Right. And so unfortunately with COVID, it could have been a purely rational thing like polio. It's like, here's the thing, here's the drug, here's the ad, and people go, yeah, well, let's all do it. But then there were forces that decided to politicize it for whatever reason, which is still unclear to me, whether it's for political gain or to not, even with Democrats going, I'm not taking that Trump vaccine. So they were it's like, oh, that's just, please, you have to go there too. And then, of course, it got polarized the other way. And
well, that's a strange thing too. Everything that happens, a lot of these things that happen in government are attributed to the president, when the president actually has very little to do with what happens. And okay, as far as countermeasures, then you talked about a couple of things. Decreasing a person's identification with anti-science groups.
Right. So if you're in a group and you've got this us-them mentality going for you, my side is against the vaccine and the other side is for the vaccine, you're not going to get people to shift sides. But one strategy that's been effective is to try to get people to think of themselves as part of a larger group. Right. So as Americans, we want to protect our economy, and we want to protect our elders, or we want to whatever. And so that's an easier strategy. You're not going to have to shift groups, but you can have them identify with a superordinate group that might favor what you're advocating. So that's probably the most effective way to deal with the group identity thing, is to.
Well, maybe we need to get attacked by another country and have another world war to get the country to pull together.
That's the classic example of the country comes together in times of crisis after 9/11, or when we're attacked. But now there's credible people who say, I wonder if already with Ukraine, and we weren't attacked, but there are people who go, it's like, well, if that side is for aid to Ukraine, then our side needs to be against aid to Ukraine, because that's how we'll differentiate ourselves. And so there was that America First thing during World War II, and the sort of the Nazis aren't that bad kind of group. but it couldn't take off like it could today. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Charles Lindbergh and the people who were sort of pushing that, pro Germany thing at the time, if they had the social media platforms and the access to people's brains like they could today, you just have to worry a little bit about what actually would happen in a case. I hate to test it, but there's reason for concern.
Yeah. And so another thing in talking to people about different, things in the science coming out in science, is to try to relate the scientific message with the person's own personal experience. Find some common ground before you even start talking to them about the science thing. So for example, I grew up on a farm in Minnesota. That may be common with the person I'm talking to. They grew up, and talk about that for a while.
Yep.
Before you even approach the science thing.
That's creating that common identity, right? That we may different, but we're both farmers, or the broadest one is we're all Americans, but if you can make it more personal, even better.
Yeah.
And that will enhance your credibility too, because it's like, where I'm coming from. So that's one strategy, is we're sort of not in this group on the attitudinal, but we're both farmers. And the other is the one I already mentioned, is to sort of acknowledge some credible things on their side. I can understand why some people are against masks. I really do.
Yeah.
Understand, as opposed to, you're so stupid, you're against masks, how could you not? Which is more what you see, right? That's more how we confront each other. That side's idiotic. That's not a way to win friends or to enhance your credibility, because then you just become a partisan hack, or you're a biased person if you're only spouting that. You need to recognize, you need to validate me. So sometimes it's, in the broadest term in psychology, it's called self-affirmation. I need to make you feel like I value you as a person.
Yeah.
And I get you, and maybe I'm even similar to you, and any kind of connection we can, and even understand. So it's, our identity could be similar. I even get some of the arguments.
Yeah.
For what you're saying. I understand.
Yeah.
What that is, and it's not that those things are stupid. It really is uncomfortable to wear a mask, and it really does impinge on your freedom to do whatever you want. So those aren't stupid things.
Yeah.
Those are valid things. And so now I feel like, oh yeah, you get me. That's what. But now you feel like, oh, now you'll listen to what some of my reasons are, because I've just validated yours, and so now you'll be open to mine. And we've done research that literally shows that people are more open to the other side, more willing to read things on the other side, once I have validated your point of view. Not to say that this is, some people get this confused with, two-sidedness, that it's not that I'm saying both sides are equally valid.
Right.
That's very confusing.
Yeah.
It's that part of, I understand why you would say that. I get where you're coming from, and there's some truth to it.
Yeah.
But the but's important.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so good. I think we covered everything that I wanted to cover.
Great.
And I've enjoyed a lot meeting you, talking with you. This is a big issue, especially as you talked about with the internet, the algorithms that put people in bubbles. If you Google something, it's really interesting. So I'm in kind of biomedical sciences. So my main source of information is PubMed.
Mm-hmm.
The actual
Yep.
scientific articles, and you can go on there and you can put in some topic, and then you add the word review, and you'll get at the top the most recent review articles on this topic. And I think in many cases, most educated Americans could, if they want to understand something, there are scientific sources that are written at a level that can be understood at least somewhat.
I'll bet
But-
ChatGPT could do that for you, even if the abstract is written in jargon. It's like translate, put this into a language the average
Yeah.
American could understand. I bet that's going to be a huge plus if it could rewrite scientific papers for
Oh, that's
people.
interesting. Yeah, that might be a good use for this artificial intelligence, the chat GPT
Yeah.
type thing. That's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that.
It'll happen. I think they used to ask. Some people have recommended that all scientific articles have a layperson section about what it means, but that's difficult, and you've got the scientists doing it, and it's hard to know exactly how to write it for a layperson because we're so used to thinking the way we do. But ChatGPT, I bet, could do it. It'd be interesting how accurate it is or whatever, but I'll bet it's something to be very capable.
Yeah, train it. Yeah, I assume it should have all scientific articles that are public available.
Yep.
In their database. So that's a positive.
Yeah.
For AI.
We need some positives for.
Yeah, maybe it could help. Boy, I don't know. We'll see what happens. It's certainly going to cause a lot of problems with disinformation, and there's concern the next election or upcoming elections, there's going to be a lot of chat GPT generated stuff.
Right. Well, if you type in, was the 2020 election stolen? I've seen different news reports on, well, some people think it is, and some people think it's like, that's not. You'd like something that just says, here's the truth, or here's the consensus, or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. It could, if all it has is what it reads on the internet, then it's going to be just as messed up as anything else. But I guess we'll see what guardrails are put around it.
Well, another thing that's happened with the generation change is kids nowadays, even young adults, are going to just like these small bits of information. They're not taking a lot of time to read books and spend several hours reading something. So they're getting these smaller bits of information, which maybe will cause some cognitive dissonance. Okay, Rich, I'll let you get back to your work at OSU.
Great. Good talking to you, Mark. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.